Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Greg Marsden from the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds. I co-chair the Special Interest Group on Governance and Decision Making with Louise Reardon, who's also here but hiding in the background. So this is, I think, number 6 of our webinar series, and we've had some really good discussions so far. I'm really looking forward to today's presentation. Just a reminder, we will be recording the session, and those go on to the WCTRS YouTube channel, so you can watch back some of our previous webinars if you've missed them, and if you're not sick of watching things on your screen. Welcome to today's speaker. We've got Dr Wijnand Veeneman, who's Associate Professor in the Faculty of Technology, Policy and Management at TU Delft. He's going to be taking us through his talk on designing governance for public transport. It will be up to half an hour talking, and then we'll have Q&A. So if you can post questions using the question and answer function rather than the chat function, that will be helpful for me in terms of moderating the questions which come in. And because of the software which Veenand's going to be using, you probably would have done this anyway, but it's better if you watch the webinar in speaker view, because you'll get a bit of interaction in the talk. So without any further ado, I'll hand over, and thank you very much and welcome.
Well, thank you all. Thanks for having me. I want to invite you at my living room table. As you can see, it's a bit of a party going on because it's my son's 18th birthday. So that's why we have the flags, and obviously that because of the privilege that I can talk to you all. Thanks for having me. So I want to take you through our perspective on designing governance. It will be a lot of public transport examples. We broaden it up a bit to energy and other infrastructures, but I'll explain why we think that is necessary. And I will do that in a bit of a different way than you might be used to. That's because my daughter, reading Law in Leiden, told me that just narrated slides doesn't cut it anymore. So we tried something, and so welcome at my living room table. Maybe a bit more about me. There we go. So my name is Wijnand Veeneman. I'm a section head of a group that's focusing on organization and governance at Delft University of Technology. Greg already talked about the faculty that we're at. Basically, what our research is, we're focusing on the governance in technological environments. So the group that I have the privilege of heading is about 50 people, depending on whom you count. That are focusing on governance issues and infrastructures. We have people working on governance of cybersecurity, on energy transitions, obviously on mobility. A smaller group in the field of public transport, 3-4 people working on governance of public transport, including me. So this is where basically we try to have a shared governance perspective on these infrastructures and how to deal with that. And part of that governance approach, this governance framework, I will try to share with you and hope that it can be useful for you as well. So my educational task is a bit more on managing complexity and again, technological environments. I'm not going to talk so much about that. And I'm also scientific director of what's called Next Generation Infrastructures. It's a Dutch corporation of 6 infrastructures managers in roads and waterways, drinking water, the Port of Rotterdam and Schiphol Airport. You might know those. Alliander, it's an energy distribution company, and Vitens is a drinking water company. They have shared issues and they in terms of governance, and this is where we help them set up research there and develop shared research programs. The approach that we have in the group is very much on decision making and governance in technological environments, and where obviously for us the governance element is really about the multi-actor aspect of things. For us, and this is where I'll get to in a moment, governance is really the rule set that tries to make it possible that a multiple set of stakeholders can make decisions together. It's that simple for us. I will talk a bit more about the literature on governance and how we draw a line through that and how that helps us on that. I'll skip a few of the examples. For us, it's important that, yes, we focus on mobility. Mobility is important to us, but when you these days you look at mobility and you don't link it to data and energy, you really you really miss an important point, because these fields are all merging with electric vehicles, with self-driving vehicles, with shared modes, there's a lot of stuff going on that is linking these fields. A quick one on the well-known scientific source of XCCD, which tries to position us a bit. Basically, when we look at our academic approaches, I think we regard ourselves as being sociologists and sometimes a bit psychologists of decision-making. So a lot of our work tries to build on sociology, but we see a development into better understand the individual in a decision-making process. Yeah, so you can see a public administration or as a specific form of sociology. We try to bring the psychological element in there as well. So it's a bit of an element, obviously, and for some people that's obvious, and for some people it's less obvious. For us, that means that a lot of the prescriptions and thus designs that we do are very contextual. And there's a lot of contingency going on, in the sense that it's very in physics, yeah, there's probably this grand unified theory. I don't think we are looking for grand unified theories. We are very happy if we can find mechanisms that actually work in a broader set of decision-making contexts, and that's how we look at it. So everything that I'm saying, I don't have the idea that they're general for everyone, but this is where the way that we try to think. Okay, Rhodes gives a nice overview of what a governance theory does, and basically when you look at the literature, there has been a moment where basically governance literature re-established the kind of government focus where it became more network oriented. We really go with that, so that's really a part of it. When we say governance is, for us, is a rule set for multi-actor decision making, it's a widening, an opening up of the perspective of more network theory, network orientation, decision-making in networks, trying to figure out, okay, how can you structure decision-making in network in a way that can be helpful? So our designs are aimed at that as well. And in that, oh, this is almost, in that approach, we use a bit of theory that is helpful for us. We are pretty liberal with how we apply it. I'll talk a bit more about that, of both Powell and Williamson. Williamson in the sense that, well, I'll talk about that in a moment when I talk a bit more about how we frame that. So let me have a go here. So what I want to take you on board with is a bit of an approach in terms of how we try to have the shared framework that helps us to design structured design questions in governance, in public transport. So I'll use public transport examples, but also in cybersecurity and energy, as I said earlier, and in water. So bear with me. So it's a simplification, but it helps to structure things, and this is where the way that we frame our approach. So let's assume that you have a representation of a railway network. Could be a model, could be some basic ideas. In ethnography, we would call it a boundary object, something that links us to the real outside network. Yes, decision making is hardly ever about linked to the real network. That's where it eventually happens, but the decision making always has some kind of modeling of representation of a system. So let's now think of that. So there is a table where basically we have a representation of a railway network of transport services. There's a timetable, there is a network map, there is a model of how the trains can be run, and that's on the table. And there are stakeholders around the table. We expect there to be stakeholders around the table that might have an interest one way or another in the way that that particular service is run and how you can do that. So this is basically our first design focus that we look at, which we call basically the process of decision making. So here we do stuff that is really process management, that is designing decision-making processes. So for example, we designed the way in which the public transport sector, with a lot of different stakeholders, thought the way that public transport payment systems in the Netherlands work with the OV-chip card, how that could be improved and how that was set up. So that process I'll talk a bit more later on how we focus that process, but traditionally you can look at how these processes worked is that there was basically a specific stakeholder that would have an idea about the system. They would try to optimize that system. So models were used to optimize the system from a mono actor perspective. And this is where, in our perspective, when you look at it from a process view, basically trying to be inclusive and intelligent about how to represent the different stakeholders in the decision-making process is a first step. Beyond that, and some of you might start recognizing Williamson slowly and gradually, that's okay, that's the idea. Okay. We look at arrangements that are driving the way that stakeholders behave on that process. So there might be contracts that are binding, in our case, in the case that I was talking about earlier about the payment system in the Netherlands. There are ways in which the operators of public transport are related to that system. They have contracts in place. So this is where those arrangements drive the way that and incentivize people in the way that they are in the decision-making process. So sometimes it's useful to think about these arrangements. A lot of work that we've done there is really about also tendering of public transport. How do you build a contracting relation between an operator and an authority? Thinking about the needs of travelers, the needs of other public stakeholders, the role of road people that are responsible for the roads. How do you bring this all together? Then we have a third layer that is important to us, and let's hope no, and that is the institutional level. So what we often see is that there is, and this is again very different, can be very different in various countries, is where we have an institutional context that is really driving the way in which the arrangements work, and that's where those arrangements drive the way in which the real decision-making process of real actors interacting with each other can work. And then finally, you have the circle where basically there's a culture around that that also sets the scene for that institutional environment. A quick example of how we try to link these things is an interesting situation that we were talking between Japanese researcher, an Australian transport operator, and ourselves about the way that they are contracting public transport services and how they are making sure that buses owned by the government but used by private operators for a small concession period, how these buses were maintained, where the Australian explained that they have large contracts. So in the arrangements, there are all kinds of provisions set up where the operator is demanded to do good maintenance to those buses in great detail. And the Japanese researchers didn't understand that at all, had no idea why that would be the case, because in Japan, when you have tendered for a particular concession, you use a bus from the public authority for that concession period. You hand it in completely pristine, because of the fact that if you wouldn't, that would be shameful from a culture perspective. Just as a quick illustration on how we might think of these generic governance approaches. I mean, we had a long stint of market-oriented governance changes, and the way that should solve a lot of issues. And this is where we think that, okay, if you don't include or at least understand in some way the context of your governance designs, that is problematic, because this is where sometimes things are arranged in the culture that you don't have to institutionalize contractual and build into a contract or give a role in the way that you design a process. So a lot of the work that we do is really about either designing a process to have a real decision making going on, thinking about arrangements and how they structure the decision making processes, rethinking the institutional context, legal frameworks for public transport provision, those kinds of things, and how they come together. Eventually, and this is what we do a lot with our colleagues elsewhere in the faculty, is also how do you build a model? How do you set up a idea of what the system is at the table? And I'll talk a bit more about that when we go further. Let me just, yeah. I'm gonna skip that one. So a bit about the process management, so about the focus on the process management. This is where we think that it's important to have this focus on understanding the gameplay and the dynamics of decision-making processes. So when people are really at the table, how do you improve the interactions between stakeholders? How you make sure that it's inclusive, that the right people are at the table, and that you have representation of some people that cannot be at the table, and you do that well. Let me just move on from there. I want to talk a bit more about a few of the challenges that we have in our design approaches, and that we think that really can help focus governance research, and how we can try to move forward governance research in this environment and move towards design. A key element there is that we as researchers bump in time and time again that you have a specific client that wants you to do some research, and that research generally puts the values that client has at the top and says, okay, we think that currently the operator is not providing the services at a low enough price. We think that's important. How can you change the governance for lowering the prices? We thought we had a governance system in place that could do that. We're now negotiating with the operator. It's not working. Could you redesign it so our values, the values that we want to change, can be incorporated better? This the starting point for us always is that, okay, but there is value multiplicity to begin with. So optimizing for a single value is always dangerous. Optimizing governance for a single value, either redesigning institutions, redesigning a contract, or focusing the process on one particular value is a problem. So this is where we focus on, okay, it's always a multi-actor problem. It's always a matter of value multiplicity, because all these actors value different things. So how do you design in an environment the governance to be inclusive for a large set of stakeholders? How do you do that? And obviously we don't believe in grand unified design, but there are clearly a few design factors. We think that a lot can be solved on the level of the design process. So, sorry, on the process design, so on the level of how the process of decision-making is organized, for as long as arrangements and institutions are not too restrictive to let the process run its course. If you now design the process to spread power and agency between stakeholders, if you design that process to be effective in terms of making decisions, this is where that can help. We also are focused more on more network-oriented governance. So it is about the stakeholders there. Sorry, my phone is ringing, which is bloody annoying. I didn't put it off, so it will stop in a moment. There we are. And a third design factor that we see, okay, is how do you integrate these different perspectives into a shared idea, a shared vision, a shared decision, a shared new form of the system, a shared moving forward of, in this case, public transport services. What is the new system, and how should that be integrated? That puts it at odds often with other perspectives where, for example, and when you look at public transport these days, there is this challenge between, we have had a long series where private companies were expected to do things better. So we had a market focus with well, in some countries really giving the service delivery and development in the hands of private companies. Other companies choosing, other countries choosing for a more stronger role for government. And these days we see basically a kind of swing back where you see in contracting in public transport in a lot of countries a re-establishment of the role of government. It was there already when you look at the way that tendering worked in a lot of countries, with a lot of strong roles for government in designing the services and the way that they were tendered out. And this is where basically our perspective is there is a specific value that you can get from the role of private companies in public transport. There is a specific value of governmental coordination that you can get. How do you bring those two together in the way that you design the governance? Just a few key topics of where we try to find solutions that help us to establish that. We focus on participative decision making. How do you do that? Again, not just in public transport, but wider. But in terms of how do you represent that system that's on the table, we focus on elements like participative modeling. How do you build the model together so you can have a shared idea of what that model can tell you about the outcomes of a new service, of a new public transport service approach? How can you have a trusted modeling approach where everyone at the table thinks, yeah, this is something that's representing the system well. And we believe that you cannot do that without more visual representations of models. So that we think that traditional modeling, more quantitative modeling, is great in the background, But if you don't have visualizations that allow more laymen in the field of modeling to understand the outcomes of those models, it's very hard to have at that table a lot of people understanding what the possible outcomes would be from a modeling perspective. So in terms of contract design, we do quite a lot of work in helping transport authorities, mostly in the Netherlands, but also in Israel, Australia, to think about how that contract is set up, how that brings that perspective from the public values that you want to realize, the sound incorporation of what the traveler wants and needs, and a good involvement of the operator in terms of defining the services and doing what they're best at. How do you contract in a way that that can work? What we often see in those countries is that there is an institutional context that is generally rather more rigid. It's not something you change very quickly. And that means that you might want to design contracts in a certain way to be more integrative or inclusive or whatever name you want to give to it, but it's pretty hard because the institutional context doesn't allow for it. We can see that, for example, when the market introduction was done in the UK, where originally really there was hardly any role left for local authorities, outside London, by the way. And we now see a swing back with really on a regional level, having a stronger role for shared decision-making in public transport. But the point there was that institutionally, that was hardly possible when John Major introduced the more market-oriented approach in public transport in the UK. So this is where the institutional context is really conditioning what you can do on an arrangement level, what you can do on a process level, and this is where we try to help institutional changes to bring in that flexibility. Another field of research that we're doing is going beyond public transport, is how do you do policy packaging in the sense that you bring together the design of public transport services, the design of mobility infrastructures in general, mobility as a service kinds of solutions, spatial development, and how do you bring all those policies in a clever way in line with each other, aiming at a certain, in a certain particular direction, so that a city can develop itself into a kind of attractive mobility future. So we don't talk that much then about what that attractive mobility future would be, but we focus far more on how you would organize for the long term the decision making that moves into that particular direction. And finally, one of the topics that we look a lot at is that value multiplicity is something that we understand quite easily when we look at the values that travelers want from public transport, the values that authorities want from public transport, and the values that operators want from public transport are different. But this is where what we see is that also the value focus between levels of government are very different, and how do you make that work? A quick example there is obviously that when you have a local neighborhood, they want accessibility from public transport. Yes, there should be bus stops. Whereas on a national level, you want far more linking of parts of the country. So on a local level, that railway line that is linking city A on that side and city B on that side can be very unattractive. On a national level, that linking of parts of the country is really attractive. And so this is where you always have this conflict in values between different governance levels. Finally, I want to talk about a quick example that we are currently working on in a very early stage, but it shows a few of the things of how we try to design governance, how that links to institutional context, how it links to mobility, and how we try to design the decision-making process to make a solution work. So this is Schiphol Airport. And in Schiphol Airport, there is this idea that you could do a lot with the electrification of mobility. Obviously, there are a lot of cars standing around. In the near future, that will be a lot of electric cars standing around. So you could, everyone wants their car to be charged up at the end of their holiday when they come back, or at the end of their business trip. So this is where, when you look at the future, there will be a lot of electric cars linked to charging stations. And that is a real big challenge in terms of the load on the electricity network, a very inefficient use of the charging infrastructure. So how do you do that? At the same time, you could flip the view on that, and you have a huge battery park at Schiphol Airport all the time, every time. If you could use those cars for bringing back that electricity into the network. There is a railway station there is an airport there that really requires high levels of energy security. So there is this promise that if you could use that electricity also in the on the airport in terms of bringing energy security, that is of great value of the airport. There's of great value for the people managing the road network. There's of great value for the people managing that station. So this is where there's, because when you do it right, you could even have regional energy provision when you look at the amounts of cars that are standing around there. Currently, when you look at institutional rules and who can do what, it's a nightmare in terms of how the decision making on such a possible future is set up. There are strong market regulations that don't allow the energy distribution company there to actually be involved in these kinds of solutions. There is no arrangement contractually other than a very simple transaction between the people who park their car there and get the energy. So it's all very fragmented. So this is where we are looking for governance solutions that try to figure out how you could make that work on an arrangement level, on an institution level, to try to get more integrated mobility and energy solutions going. Just a quick example of what we're working at and where we try to design the governance, whereas others are trying to figure out whether technically it can work at all. So there are also technical challenges, but this is where we work with them together. That's why we are at the Technical University, work with them together to figure out how you can build the governance for that and design the governance for that. Okay. That was my talk. I hope it helped you a bit, and I'm looking forward to questions.
That's great. Thanks a lot. You have to just imagine a kind of ripple of applause at this point on these kinds of talks. give you a feeling of some atmosphere in the room. We've got some questions coming through on the Q&A already, so I encourage others to post. Let's start with this one from Roger. Do you discuss transparency and business secrecy? Have you got any examples maybe of how that features?
Obviously, so this is where what we see is that when you look at that perspective, the process perspective, where you have a bunch of people at the table, obviously some people at that table are bound by a set of rules for with those they represent. So if you are a company representative in the decision-making process and you're not willing to share, some of the information, that is limiting the trust at the table. So yes, that is an issue. We did a project on railway maintenance contracting for Dutch ProRail, where we were looking at ways in which both ProRail and the railway maintainers that got the contracts the conditions under which they would open up their financial, commercial information a bit more for each other, and how that could help the decision making at the table. So we then are trying to look for ways in which what is shareable, what's not shareable, how can you use trusted third parties to provide some kind of transparency without transferring the information. So that's all process design, where we try to, indeed that is a difficult aspect to work with, but where we try to find solutions for that process to move forward, even though there is this limitation of well, transparency in some cases. Yes, so definitely it is a big issue which we try to deal with. Not always works, but that's where we try to find solutions.
Great, thanks. The next one I've got, I think this is from Jens. Thanks for a nice presentation. I wonder if there are any critical and or normative perspectives you bring into the framework. So are you critical of existing structures in any way? Do you have a view as to specific ways for arranging governance, or are you entirely kind of context kind of focused in trying to kind of answer practical questions through understanding the governance system, I guess?
So let's be clear, it might sound very the latter, but if you say there's a vector towards network-oriented and inclusive decision-making, that is because we recognize that a lot of the decision-making is exclusive and power-driven and selective, and this is where that doesn't necessarily lead to better public outcomes. That's what we believe. So there is, even though there is an idea, I think we are critical thinkers in that sense, and we see a problem with a lot of existing institutions and approaches, and this is where we try to, but this is where we are not the kind of people that now start writing on a theoretical level the critical theory. What we try to do is design governance that helps inclusiveness in that sense. So the answer is maybe both, because yes, we see that governance is often designed to be selective in agency, and we think that leads to qualitative, well, less good solutions. So this is where we try to extend that and be more inclusive.
Great, thanks for that. I'll pick one of my questions. So just looking at your sort of conceptual ring diagram, you talked about culture, setting the context within which institutions, arrangements and processes worked. Just wondering what your kind of, how monocultural that approach is. Like, is there one culture, or are there multiple cultures which are at play at any one time? I'm just wondering if you could say a bit more about how you feel that culture shapes institutions, for example.
Okay, so the example I gave is a simplistic one. Yes, so there is something like a national culture, and that means that if I can go to Israel and think about contracting there, I basically don't understand anything that's going on. Yeah, so this is where on that level, it's clear that, and that's a simplistic version. Yeah? The simplest version is already problematic. Yeah, so let's be clear on that. It's when you drill it down to the culture differences that everyone sees, for governance design, it really takes time to understand how a culture is reflected in institutional and contractual relations and how that is shown up in the decision-making process. The way that I deal with it is just start very open, and I've not come in guns blazing and saying you should do this. but try to figure out how that works and work a lot with the locals to try to understand how the lessons that we have from contracting railway services in the UK and Germany and France and the Netherlands and Scandinavian countries, how that applies, or if it even applies, in a very different context. And then we look at different smaller mechanisms that might actually be helpful and might be implemented. And that's where basically we're doing more tweaking than we come with grand designs. I think the point that you're talking about, that even within that context, there is a wide cultural variety if you look close. Yeah, so this is where the value, so this is the way that I try to frame that and try to deal with it. The value focus of different stakeholders in decision making could be a reflection of their culture. And that's the best guess that we have. And we want them to be involved and bring that in. But it's at best a good attempt to deal with culture differences between well, public and private and players, between well, a whole lot of different stakeholders. So why it's there, it's not because we understand that culture, how culture drives all that, but if you don't put that contextualization on the table and allow yourself to be a bit more, what would be the word? Well, hold back a bit, and this is where I think you missed the point. One of my PhDs has worked at the World Bank, and he always came back to this complete limited the complete lack of understanding of how World Bank solutions would work in those cultural environments. So the best way that we try to deal with that is getting people on the table, start trying to get that process going, let people bring their value preferences to the table, try to get a shared idea of what the system is that we are talking about, in this case, often public transport services or infrastructures or stuff like that. And then from that, build a shared view, even though there are different cultural backgrounds. I don't know whether that's an answer to your question, Greg, but at least the key answer, I think, is that we need that cultural ring there to accept the fact that it's highly contextual, and that the simple answers aren't there, and this where we really want to build it up from the inside out rather than and have people involved and dealing with it that way.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting response. I've got a PhD student at the moment who's looking at how we went from privatizing rail to, you know, where we were seeking to put it at arm's distance from the state, to it now being one of, you know, being increasingly heavily subsidized. It's one of the largest infrastructure spend sectors that, you know, that we have, and part of this, I think, is a kind of evolution over time and move away from the privatization or the nature of the privatization mentality that was there at the time in the 1990s. And so certainly that's all matured and changed. And I think it's one of the areas in which you can begin to understand how and why institutions change over time. So yeah, that was interesting.
And this is where I think that it's interesting to see the differences there in how that worked in different countries in Europe, where we saw that in the Netherlands, we were under the same EU regulation, but it always stayed far more some kind of cooperation between the private and the public in a tendering environment that allowed for a lot of private optimizations within a public value-oriented system. Whereas in the UK, it seems to be far more a pendulum swing back and forth that used that European push to more market orientation and went for it, and now seems to be going back even further than we are used to in the Netherlands.
Okay. Next question is, but it could be a yes/no answer, but I think there's something a lot deeper to this. Do Dutch public transport, or politicians involved in public transport and bureaucrats like accountability? So maybe it's more a question of how does accountability affect decision making in public transport or attitudes to accountability?
Do we know politicians that like accountability at all? So the answer to okay, so I go to my own against my own rules. I said there are no general always true answers, but this might be one. No. So no, they don't like it, but I have a sense that in the Rhineland environment, yeah, so the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, maybe even parts of Scandinavia, the public sphere has a far less problematic relation with accountability than in other parts of Europe, maybe. So, no, no, they don't like accountability, but I think there is a sense of, oh, I'm gonna use very silly words, sense of duty or something like that. I don't know. There is a feel that yes, you should deliver public transport for the good of the people. That's what it's about, and it doesn't always work. And then, but there seems to be this focus, I guess, and I see that in Germany as well. A lot of people working on to deliver the public transport for the public good.
Great, thanks. Next question, I think it's probably one a lot of people are thinking about. I'm pretty sure we don't know the answer to, but be really interested in your views on this from a multi-actor perspective. So Mariana asks, could we say that an open ecosystem approach managed by enterprises like WIM, mobility as a service, would be an answer to new forms of governance and decision making? Does an open ecosystem help us, or does it just create new arrangements, new processes that we need to think through?
Okay, so my take on mobility as a service, whether it's WIM or Transer or whomever, is that it was this platform solution that landed in some kind of institutional void. Yeah, there wasn't anything there, and this is where they showed how that could work in hotels and in taxis and renting out houses, and we can make it work in doing this for a wide set of mobility services. But when you look at the way that these platforms land in an institutional void, there is no regulation, there is nothing there. That institutional void is filled up rather quickly because of downsides of the approach. So what I now see is that where WIM was, the original idea of MAS was that this global platform of integration of mobility services, where they would deliver that everywhere, and you would buy the services from them. It would be the Vodafone of mobility. What we now see is that WIM and Transer and the others are delivering to transport authorities. So it's classic transition theory. You have a niche coming up, but it's encapsulated by the existing regime. And now what we see is that they are doing a better job of integrating services than governments have been doing for a long time. So in that sense, I think it's very interesting. But I go back then to the framework that we have. Okay, they're now a new player at the table in designing services. So how do you include the value that they can deliver in a clever way in systems that are trying to provide services for vulnerable people, that are trying to keep prices low for people who can't afford it, that try to keep some kind of system integrity, which we need in public transport. It's all these different levels of services that have to work together, and that actually provide a public value. It's just one more player at the table. How can we build up the governance that for them, their role can be work in a synergetic way with what's already there. That is a tricky one, by the way. A lot of people well, we did an analysis of how that worked in Birmingham, Amsterdam, and Stockholm. And this is where we saw that, sorry, Helsinki, and this is where we saw that that there is, like in any transition, a very strong role for the existing players in just encapsulating it and bringing it to the original state without the big disruption going on, which is a pity because you could use it to create more value, I think, in mobility. So no, it's not going to be this big disruptional change that is going to change everything. But I'm afraid that basically the value that it could deliver is eroding rapidly. So I hope that we can change the institutional environment a bit and the governance a bit, so the value that they can create, that it can be delivered to the mobility systems of as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Like what the different actors are trying to get out of these kinds of opportunities. Radically changes who needs to be at the table and with what resources and to what end. So yeah, I think it's really helpful.
Just a quick one. So what we now see, for example, in the Netherlands, is that basically transport authorities are tendering out mass services. Yes, so they ask, deliver us mass services from the market. So now this is this weird situation where it's just transport authorities that are defining what mass is and getting the players in, rather than this global platform that was going to take over and erode public transport. It's integrated. And that environment seems to be, at least as far as I saw it, seems to be a tendering environment where you ask for more integrated services, including a mass perspective, seems to work pretty well.
Yeah, great. Okay, we've got a question in from David Weinrich. Thanks so much for the talk. Could you talk about the role of public funding and regulation, or lack thereof? His example is a bridge that collapsed in Genoa. What kinds of worst cases are we trying to avoid, and how important is that in the design of governance?
Okay, so just my takeaway from, so let's set the scene a bit. So the bridge in Genoa that collapsed was a private constructed and maintained bridge, yes, where the government was paying for these, I think, a lump sum every year for having the bridge, but it was maintained in the private sector, by the private sector, by Autostrada, I think it's called. By the way, they're also the people that you can buy coffee from at this roadside cafes in Italy. But so in that environment, when we privatize part of the infrastructure, is that problematic or not? Okay, and here's my general answer always, it depends, yes? So what we saw here is apparently maintenance. So this is where I don't really know why it collapsed. So this is where now we get into a bit of a problematic situation, but apparently it collapsed, so it probably wasn't maintained very well. So this is where this is where we lift it to a different level. Can you, in a contractual arrangement, secure public values like security of infrastructure? That's what's going on here. The safety of the people using that. Can you secure that in a public-private transaction in a contractual environment? I think you can, but it's bloody difficult. There are there's a lot of very simplistic ideas of how you incentivize private parties to align with public goals. But when we then look at how trust and uncertainty and the dynamics of the environment, how they erode these incentives that seemed a good idea when you wrote the contract, but later on prove really problematic, this is where it proves to be very, very complicated and dynamic. So my basic go-to there is, and that's what you could have read from the slides, is that you always have to design it as a constant co-production. You can still give, I think, private parties an important role, but if you expect to hand it over and let the contract do all the securing of public values down the line, I think you missed the point of the role of government in securing those public values. It's not a piece of paper that can do that. So the contract doesn't do that. It's about regulatory oversight. It's about co-production. There's far more that is involved there in making that kind of public-private interaction work. I don't know whether that's an answer to this question. It's definitely not only about the bridge in Italy, but it's the way that I think generically you should be thinking about that public-private interaction, whether it's about defining service levels of public transport, building bridges, the type of drinking water that comes out of a tap, all these kinds of things.
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting observations. I think that the challenges of long-term contractual relationships are huge, given the uncertainties that we're currently facing about what the mobility system will look like. I mean, even something as apparently simple as you know, a PFI contract for replacing all the street lighting in a local authority area. Well, now actually we decide maybe we want to use those poles for charging EVs. Well, you haven't written that into the contract, so then that becomes a challenge. In the UK with the rail system, we had a similar kind of set of questions. We had a big rail accident after we privatized the rail industry, and they weren't maintaining. They didn't know what the state of their assets was. No, I guess everyone had assumed that they would do that because private sector would be efficient and would want to know its assets, but they didn't game it. And I think that kind of the model that you're talking about would encourage you to think through what the different actors' strategies could be within the setting that they're given. But there were also plenty of accidents under public oversight in the decades that preceded that. So how much of that was a public or a private issue still to be worked out. We're coming up to the hour mark. So I think unless I've got a really straightforward question, we'll draw it to a close there. Yeah, I think that's probably the right point to stop the Q&A and to thank you so much for your time. It was nice to have a kind of more of a conceptual walkthrough how you think about the problem, because I think that allows people to go away and think about how they see the issues. And you've given us some great literature pointers for those people working in the field, how you conceptualize it. So it's been a really great presentation, and thank you so much for your time.
Well, glad to have you at my living room table. I hope it felt a bit like that, being, although I'm not allowed to have 25 people in the room, but at least I try to make it feel that way. And thanks for having me. Thanks for being able to do this.
Great, and we've got one more webinar before Christmas. Louise, I don't know if Milos has replied. It's going to be in the probably the 16th or the 18th of December, around smart mobility themes, but we're just having to rejig the date. But we'll get that out on Twitter, on the LinkedIn group. If you're not following that, then please do join that, and hope to see you all in December. We won't have flags. Enjoy the rest of the birthday party, Veeneman, but maybe we'll have Christmas decorations in the background for the next one.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.